We use reason so naturally that we almost never notice it. We wake up and assume the world will behave coherently. We assume causes lead to effects. We assume contradictions matter. We assume that evidence can support or undermine a belief. We assume all of this before we ever think about God. When someone says, "There is no God," they are not merely expressing a mood or an emotion. They are making a claim, one that expects to be understood, evaluated, challenged, defended, or refuted. That expectation alone is already remarkable. It assumes that words have stable meanings. Arguments can be valid or invalid. Truth is something we can aim at rather than merely invent. But here is the strange part. None of these assumptions are obvious in a universe made only of particles, forces, and blind processes. We rarely ask the most basic question of all. Why should reason exist at all? Why should the universe be intelligible to the human mind? Why should abstract principles, like logic and mathematics, apply equally to thoughts, language, and physical reality? Why should the same rules govern atoms, arguments, and algorithms? And perhaps most unsettling, why do even the strongest arguments against God depend completely on the trustworthiness of reason? Tonight, we are not going to attempt a traditional proof of God. We are going to do something quieter. We are going to look at reason itself and ask what happens to it when God is removed from the picture. What we may discover is not a refutation of atheism, but something stranger. That reason, without God, begins to feel oddly ungrounded, as if it still works, but no longer knows why. Part 1: The Atheist Commitment to Reason. Atheism, especially in its modern form, is deeply committed to reason. This is often overlooked by both critics and defenders. Atheist thinkers typically emphasize evidence over authority, explanation over mystery, argument over tradition. From the Enlightenment onward, reason has been framed as the great liberator, freeing humanity from superstition, dogma, and blind faith. And to be clear, this commitment to reason is not a weakness. It is the very thing that gives atheist critiques their force. When atheists challenge belief in God, they appeal to logical consistency, empirical adequacy, coherence with what we know about the world. Even when religion is criticized emotionally or morally, the criticism is usually framed as rational. This belief doesn't make sense. This claim contradicts the evidence. This argument is invalid. None of these are attacks on faith as such. They are appeals to reason. And that matters. Because reason is not optional in atheism. You cannot argue against God without assuming that truth exists, that arguments can track it, that contradictions count against a worldview. Even skepticism itself presupposes reason. To doubt something rationally is still to trust rational standards. So atheism does not reject reason. It relies on it absolutely. Which raises a question that is rarely addressed. If reason is this central, what is it? Not how we use it, but what kind of thing it is, and why it exists at all. Part 2: What is reason made of? Reason is not a physical object. You cannot hold a valid argument in your hand. You cannot measure a syllogism in grams. You cannot detect a logical law with a particle accelerator. You can observe brains. You can observe neurons firing. You can observe electrical and chemical activity. But none of those things are true or false. A neuron does not assert a proposition. A synapse does not commit a fallacy. A chemical reaction does not follow a logical rule. Reason consists of abstract principles like the law of non-contradiction, the law of identity, the law of excluded middle. These are not empirical generalizations. They are not discovered by experiment. They are presupposed by experiment. No scientist tests whether contradictions exist. No experiment checks whether logic applies today. Logic is already assumed before any test begins. And these principles are universal, necessary, timeless. They apply whether or not anyone believes them. They apply in every possible place. They apply even if no human minds exist. Which makes them deeply strange in a materialist universe. If everything that exists is physical, then reason is an anomaly. Because reason is not located in space, not extended in time, not subject to decay, not governed by physical laws. And yet, it governs our thinking. It tells us not merely how we think, but whether our thinking is correct. This creates a tension, because material processes explain how beliefs form, but they do not explain why some beliefs are rationally justified. And that difference matters. Part 3. Can evolution explain reason? At this point, many people turn to evolution. The explanation usually goes something like this. Human reasoning evolved because it helped our ancestors survive. Better predictions led to better decisions. Better decisions led to survival and reproduction. Therefore, reason is just an evolved tool. At first glance, this sounds convincing. But there is a subtle problem. Evolution selects for behaviors that enhance survival, not beliefs that are true. Truth and survival often overlap, but they are not the same thing. A false belief can be extremely adaptive. Imagine an early human who believes every movement in the grass is a predator. This belief is false most of the time, but it might keep them alive. Evolution does not care whether the belief is accurate, only whether it produces survival-enhancing behavior. This leads to an unsettling implication. If our cognitive faculties are shaped solely by survival pressures, then we have no guarantee that they track truth. We only know that they track usefulness. And usefulness does not equal truth. So when we use reason to arrive at abstract conclusions about cosmology, metaphysics, or God, we are trusting something that evolution alone cannot fully justify. In fact, evolution undercuts its own authority. Because if our reasoning is shaped only by survival, then the belief, my reasoning is reliable, is itself just another evolved belief. It may be useful, but why assume it is true? This creates a quiet circularity. We use reason to justify naturalism, but naturalism struggles to justify reason. Part 4. The normativity problem. There is another feature of reason that is even harder to explain. Reason is normative. It does not merely describe how we think. It tells us how we ought to think. We say, that conclusion doesn't follow. You made a logical mistake. That argument is invalid. These are not observations. They are judgments. They assume a standard that transcends individual minds. If someone reasons badly, we do not say, well, that's just how their brain happens to fire. We say, they are wrong. But wrongness is not a physical property. Physics describes what is. Logic tells us what ought to be believed given certain premises. And this ought is not optional. You cannot opt out of logic without already using logic. You cannot deny rational standards without appealing to rational standards. Which raises a deep question. Where does this obligation come from? In a purely physical universe, there are particles obeying laws. There are brains following causal chains. But there is no obligation to think correctly. Atoms do not care about fallacies. Neurons do not respect validity. And yet, we do. We feel that irrationality is not just inefficient but improper. That sense of intellectual responsibility does not come from chemistry. It comes from meaning. Part 5. Reason as a gift or an accident. At this point, we face a fork in the road. Either reason is a cosmic accident, a useful illusion produced by blind forces, or reason reflects something deeper about reality itself. If reason is an accident, then trust in logic is ultimately unjustified. Rational debate loses its foundation. Truth becomes a byproduct of survival rather than a goal. But if reason is fundamental, if the universe is intelligible because it is grounded in intelligence, then reason makes sense. Not as proof, not as coercion, but as coherence. In the classical theistic view, reason is not mysterious. It is not floating above reality. It is woven into the structure of the world. The human mind can understand reality because reality itself is ordered. And that order is not accidental. This does not prove God. But it explains why reason fits the universe so well. Why mathematics describes nature. Why logic governs both thought and reality. Why truth feels like something we discover rather than invent. Part 6. The quiet dependence of atheism on reason. Here is the quiet paradox. Atheism uses reason to argue against God. But reason itself becomes strangely difficult to explain without something like God. This does not mean atheists are irrational. Science collapses. Arguments against God are meaningless. It means something more subtle. That atheism borrows tools whose deepest justification lies beyond its own framework. This borrowing is usually invisible. It happens quietly, automatically, unconsciously. Every argument assumes that logic applies universally, that truth is objective, that minds can know reality. These assumptions are not proven by atheism. They are assumed by it. And that assumption points beyond a purely material world. Not as a threat, not as an accusation, but as a philosophical tension. Conclusion. Reason's unanswered question. Reason works. We trust it. We depend on it. We build science, ethics, and philosophy upon it. But its existence remains strangely unexplained in a universe of blind matter. Why should reality be rational? Why should the universe be intelligible? Why should truth be something minds can grasp at all? Perhaps belief in God is not the strangest thing humans do. Perhaps the strangest thing is reason itself, without God. And that question remains open.